All right. I want to welcome everybody to this week's Saturday LaRouche Pack class. It is August the 5th. And tonight, I think we're going to have a very provocative discussion with Bruce Director. It is August, and I have to say, sometimes you feel like you're stuck in the summer reruns of what Donald Trump's campaign today called the Fraud Squad. They put out a very funny but very appropriate campaign ad going through the fraudulent nature of the attacks against him. Because of course, as we know, this week was indictment number 3 and from the special prosecutor, Jack Smith. Now, I was also reminded of that statement by Einstein, which went approximately, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. The elites of this planet seem to think that by indicting Donald Trump over and over again, by running this lawfare operation, they think they're going to terrorize the American population and somehow stop Donald Trump. Obviously, the exact opposite is happening. Trump the other day said if he gets one more indictment, it will assure his reelection. And as we've seen, the support for him continues to crescendo. The more these guys come down with these with this insane lawfare kind of activity, and the insanity of these elites is in actually their view of mankind, because they think they can continue to just behavior modify us, like they do their pet dogs, or probably their housekeepers, train their pet dogs. I'm sure they don't. By manipulating people, on the basis of opinions, their senses, and so on. And they keep trying this over and over again. Indictment number 3, impeachment number 2, and on and on and on. As Bruce is going to address tonight, something else is going on, which is not in the domain that these elites are attempting to manipulate. It is not in the domain of public opinion. It is not in the domain of people's feelings. They think they're going to terrify people, and the exact opposite is happening in many cases. Something is happening in a very, very different domain. It's what I addressed in the last 2 classes I did on several of Plato's dialogues. But there is a domain in which the human mind functions where the human senses don't. And it's in that domain that a revolution is actually taking place. So I think Bruce is going to take us in a very interesting direction tonight, and I want to turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Let me just remind people, since Susan referenced the summertime, although it is a time often of relaxation and vacations and people getting well-deserved breaks, it's also the time in which major world crises erupt. Remind you that both world wars started in the summer. 9/11 occurred at the end of the summer. And you can go throughout history and find many things that occur in the summertime when people are relaxed and not necessarily prepared for a fight, that appear to be things that should not last very long, and they end up lasting years and plunging the world into a tremendous crisis. And I think that's really where we are right now. The events over the last few months, but especially over the last week, I would characterize as a increasing and accelerating crisis, both for the United States and for the world. For the United States, because of the acceleration of the effort to turn the United States really into a globalist dictatorship, which has been going on for a long, long time, but accelerated, especially after 2015 when Trump came down the escalator, and all throughout his presidency, and since then. And the indictment this week is sort of, as Susan indicated, sort of even further out on the limb. The other thing for the world is because if they succeed in doing this to the United States, then the world has no hope. And I know that there's a lot of stuff on the internet, and people have been talking about the promise of the BRICS, or the promise of a new currency coming about, or some new constellation of forces, while the United States plunges into a globalist dictatorship, that somehow that's an out for humanity. And I would caution anyone of thinking that that's a possibility. It is not. We either save the United States, or the world is going to go, as LaRouche warned many times, into a long, prolonged dark age. Now, it is necessary for us to recognize the gravity of the situation, but we cannot let the gravity of the situation generate fear. We may not be able to avoid a sense of fear, but we cannot give in to fear. And in order to overcome fear, you actually have to look at, as Susan indicated, a higher principle. She spoke about this in the last two classes, which if you didn't see those, they're up on the website. And I strongly recommend that you review them with respect to a couple dialogues of Plato. She's also talked about this in other classes, and it's extremely relevant to what we're going to be discussing tonight, because Athens faced a similar question and similar situation, not exactly the same as she indicated, but they failed. And Socrates addressed some of the things which I'm going to be talking about tonight. And it was the inability of Athenian society to grasp these questions that ultimately led to the failure of Athens. But we cannot let the United States fail, and we don't have to, because we actually have a very good shot of turning this thing around, and actually, as Trump often says, making America great again. Now, for those of us who lived through the prosecutions and persecutions of Lyndon LaRouche back in the 70s and 80s, and also into the 90s, we have a certain experience with this and a certain insight into this kind of legal attacks, where the entire full force of the federal and state governments, along with private organizations, the media, the Anti-Defamation League, and so forth, all come down on a political organization to try and snuff it out. We've reported the history just very briefly. You know, in 1973, the FBI collaborated with the Communist Party to try and assassinate LaRouche. In the mid 1970s, the Carter administration and the FBI did everything they could to try and bankrupt LaRouche and our movement. In 1980, LaRouche ran for president in the Democratic Party, and effectively defeated George H.W. Bush's chances of becoming president, ensuring that Reagan would get in. And in the early part of the Reagan administration, LaRouche played a crucial role in getting Reagan to adopt the SDI. He was opposed by the very same forces that are going after Trump, including some of the same people, like Robert Mueller in his younger days, who at the time was head of the criminal division in the Justice Department, British intelligence, the ADL, NBC TV, the media, and so on and so forth. This is all well documented in FBI files and discovery that came out, which led ultimately to a series of federal and state indictments, grand jury investigations, raids on our offices, and ultimately a bankruptcy of some of the companies that were associated with publications of LaRouche. Now, of course, this was before the internet age, so our communications abilities was much more limited. On the other hand, in the 1984 presidential campaign, LaRouche and our movement was able to raise sufficient funds to buy 15 national half-hour television broadcasts in which LaRouche connected with the American people in a way that I don't think any politician had connected with the American people since Roosevelt, and hasn't since then until Donald Trump decided to run for president. Now, I'm not saying that Trump and LaRouche are the same. What I'm saying is that there are the same processes going on, because they were both threatening the neocon globalist agenda in the context of how politics was playing out at the time. And the very same ferocity with which the globalists in the British Empire mobilized to crush that movement was commensurate and proportional to what we're witnessing right now. Now, something is going on that, as Susan indicated, the oligarchy doesn't understand and can't understand. But it's also something that most of Trump's supporters don't quite understand, and that's what I want to discuss tonight. Let's just take the example that the more they go after Trump, the more they slander him, the stronger his support. And unlike what the media says, that this support is the hardcore MAGA base, a small portion of the Republican Party, it's not. He's gaining more and more support, and in fact solidifying support from segments of the population that the oligarchy and the media say had distanced themselves from Trump because of his strong stance with respect to the questions about the 2020 election and his other strong positions that the enemy said alienated independent voters, suburban women, African Americans, et cetera, and yet the more they go after Trump now, the more that support solidifies. And it's not just because in reaction to people going after him, which does gain a certain sympathy support, and it does make it clear to people that if you allow this kind of attack to be levied against a former president of the United States, current frontrunner for the next presidency, to be levied by a corrupt Justice Department and administration run by his opponent. And don't let anybody kid you, these are not career officials. I saw Merrick Garland come out and speak to the cameras on Thursday after Trump's arraignment and say that this is the career unbiased, apolitical officials of the Justice Department who launched the investigation into January 6th, and it's become the largest investigation in US history. And they're the people who are doing their job. And this is completely above the board. That's just 100% BS. And Barbara Boyd has has written extensively on our website and also made some presentations in which if you need more information to explain why that's the case, you can get it there. So I don't need to repeat it, but you also know it's BS. But this is an ongoing corruption of private forces associated with the British Empire and with globalist agendas who have hijacked the power of the government to carry out their political ends, which is to not just crush Trump, but as he often says, they're going after him because they're really going after you. And it's true, they're going after us. And that's the same reason why they went after LaRouche. So you have something that's going on, as I indicated, which is contrary to that, which is that number one, people are it's having a negative effect in terms of strengthening the populations and the supporters' commitment and intensity to resist this and to ultimately defeat it. I think you also see something interesting in Trump himself, and that the way he's speaking, if you look at his recent speeches, and I'm not trying to get into his head and psychoanalyze him and so forth, but there's a certain, I don't know what the right word is, mood or intensity, or something that is not really articulable in what he's going through, especially when in the recent weeks when he said, I'm not going to give up, even if they put me in prison, I'll still run for president. And I think that belies something very profound, which is also resonating with the American people, which is the human quality, and the most important human quality, of being willing to sacrifice everything for the truth and for the future of mankind. This is a quality, I will get back to this more in this presentation, but this is a key important quality. It's expressed that way as a commitment of an act of willing to sacrifice everything for the truth, for a higher power, for a higher principle. That, of course, characterizes America. The passion of the founding fathers to risk everything when it was highly unlikely that they could pull off a successful revolution, and even less likely that they could create an actual self-governing republic. And yet they did. And not just the founding fathers that we read about in history books, but the ordinary colonists who were not so ordinary when it came time to fight, who rose to the occasion and did extraordinary things because of that same quality of passion. And I think we're seeing that not just in Trump, but also in the population itself. But these are the outward expressions of something that is, in a certain sense, much more profound, that you can't really describe or see or visible to the senses. And that's what I want to try and discuss tonight. LaRouche often pointed to this principle from many standpoints, especially on the standpoint of physical science, where he talked about the idea that you can't base physical science on sense perception. This was not a unique discovery by LaRouche. It was a reiteration of something that was well known, as Susan described in the discussions with Plato. This is the main fight between Plato and Aristotle, where Aristotle said that the only way you know anything is basically by sense perception. That's what what you see, touch, feel, smell, taste, etc. And Plato, who understood that no, you have to go beyond that. You have to look beyond the sense perceptible appearances and discern the actual principles that are governing the behavior that you perceive with your senses that impacts you. This has been a fundamental principle of all scientific discovery, certainly in recorded form for the last 2,500, 3,000 years, but we have anecdotal archaeological evidence, which I think demonstrates that throughout all of human history. I like to refer to the famous book by Max Planck in the 1930s. He was the great physicist who was a collaborator with Einstein, the discoverer of what later became known as quantum physics, although he rejected the Copenhagen interpretation, the irrationalism of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. But in the context of this debate, because there was many discoveries that were going on in the latter part of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that challenged sense perception. No one saw atoms. In fact, there was an argument about whether or not atoms existed. Because you couldn't see them, they were beyond the domain of science at all. And yet we had experimental evidence, which is all fascinating. There's lots of books that are read, that you can read, that describe the experimental work that led to these discoveries, like Rutherford's gold foil experiment, or the Stern-Gerlach experiment, or the double slit experiments. All these various experiments, the black body radiation, physical things which indicated that the world did not behave fundamentally in principle the way your senses tell you it had to behave. And he wrote a book called Where is Science Going?, in which he took up this debate, and he encapsulated this very simply by saying, initially science and the branches of science arose from the senses. The things that were visible, optics was a science because it affected the eyes and what you could see. Acoustics was the science of what you could hear. Astronomy was also a branch of optics because it was based on the observations, what you see, of the motions of the planets. Heat was associated with the science of touch because that's how you discern heat. If you had no sense of touch, you would not know the difference between hot and cold. Chemistry arose out of the sense of taste and smell. All our vocabulary from chemistry, acids, bases, sugars, these things which now have very technical meanings, had very simple meanings based on associations with the senses of taste and smell. But as science progressed, it began to realize, Planck tells us, that these things are all the same, that heat is really just a form of light. It's radiation of infrared light. That's what we feel as heat. And other forms of light we don't sense as heat. And some forms of light we can't sense at all, like ultraviolet light, or X-rays, or gamma rays, or radio waves. We have a very limited ability to perceive the entire, what we now call the electromagnetic spectrum. That taste and smell and the ideas of chemistry are also forms of electromagnetic effects. And Planck sort of goes through this whole story. So now you have basically just one science, which is not really based on the senses at all. And that's the future. That's where science is going. But then what does science become if it's not based on sense perception? What are we actually investigating? We're making theories and discoveries, and actually applying theories and discoveries to phenomena which we cannot directly perceive. We can manipulate atoms. We can cause changes in the behavior of things we're unable to perceive directly, or even with aid of certain instruments. And yet we can continue to investigate this. Now, both Einstein and Planck saw a history in this in the work of great scientists in the past. For example, Kepler, who discovered a principle of gravitation, which is nothing you can see, that defied the actual observations and contradicted the assumptions that science had made based on those observations. Quite simply, based on observations and sense perception, I'll give you a simple example of this. A circle is the simplest form of motion, because all you need to have a circle is a center and a distance, a radius. And once you have that, you can move in a circle. And so it was assumed that since this is the simplest form of motion and the most perfect form of motion, the planets moved in perfect circles, and all the stars and all the heavenly bodies. And yet when you observe the planets, they had a characteristic where they sped up and slowed down. And how could that be occurring in a perfect circle? And so Kepler was able to discover, and this is a beautiful whole process of discovery, which is beyond the scope of our discussion tonight, but something that I think should be part of the middle school education, to relive Kepler's discovery, because it'll improve the thinking process of students for the rest of their lives. That the planets did not move in perfect circles, that they moved in ellipses or eccentric orbits, orbits that were not based around movement around a center in a perfect circle. And that they actually did speed up and slow down based on a physical principle of gravitation. And he then elaborated how this worked. And that was further elaborated by Gauss and others. And Kepler didn't make the final solution, but he did set the stage for all of science which occurred after that. And we could discuss many, many such examples. And Einstein in the early 1930s, just as Germany was descending into Nazism, wrote an article on the anniversary of Kepler's passing, in which he said that in times of uncertainty like this, we look to Kepler, who was so committed and sure of the capability of the human mind to discover the lawfulness of the universe, that he was able to he lived in a very similar time, the time leading up to and the outbreak of the 30 Years' War. And yet he was so committed to the lawfulness, to understanding the lawfulness of the universe, that he was able to make these discoveries. In other words, Kepler connected emotionally, passionately to a principle that the universe is governed by a higher lawfulness, a higher power, which, although everything around you seems like it's unlawful and irrational, is actually the effect of something much more powerful and lawful, which exists, as LaRouche would later say, and Kepler also indicated this, in all domains, in physical domain, what we might call the abiotic, in life, and in human culture and human thought and human behavior. So and it's this that you need to have an understanding of this. You need to have a commitment to this. You need to hang on to this concept and this idea in times like this. This is not only what gets you through a time like this, but it gives you the strength, the insights, and the power to actually act in the way that can, in our case, defeat a crisis, defeat an oligarchy, which is manifestly satanic, and actually reestablish a nation which is manifestly based on a principle of the good. So I'd like to just give you a few pedagogical examples to maybe try and illustrate the general principle that I discussed just a few minutes ago, over the last few minutes. So let's start first by looking at some examples from the astrophysical domain. I gave you one example with Kepler. You're familiar with others because we have the fortune of great new technologies which remind us of this principle and illustrate this all the time. So Susan, why don't you put up the first slide, which is a picture here of the Stevens Quintet, which is actually conglomeration of 5 galaxies which appear close to each other, although they're not exactly that close to each other. And this was taken, I think, by the Hubble or maybe the James Webb telescope, I'm not sure. But one thing that's interesting about this picture is that it's superimposed of several wavelengths, different wavelengths of light. So the blue there in the middle is the ultraviolet light. The white and other colors are visible light, and then there's also some red in there, which is infrared light. So this is not what you would see with a telescope, but it's what you see when you use advanced instrumentation, which has been created by mankind to supplement our feeble senses, to be able to, in effect, extend our sense perception. But this, what you see there, is not what is not the principle. What you see is the effect of the principle of electromagnetism and gravitation and so forth, which is causing the phenomena to behave the way it's behaving. And I think most astronomers would recognize that this that our understanding of these principles is really very, very, very incomplete. Although we can make a lot of guesses and hypotheses, but all this new material gives us great impetus to discover something new. So let's take the next one and we'll give it we'll look at this example. Now this is from the Webb telescope, and you see a center of a blue center and then sort of a red halo around it. Now, the Webb telescope collects light in the infrared spectrum. And what's interesting about this picture is that based on the spectrum, you see red here, but if you were to put this light through a prism and analyze the different wavelengths and the intensity of the different wavelengths that are given off by this phenomena here, you would see that there are many different wavelengths. And these wavelengths are characteristic of complex organic molecules. Now, according to the astronomers who have analyzed this, they estimate that the red halo there, which is where the organic molecules have been detected, is about 13 billion light years away. The center blue ring disk is a different galaxy, which is actually nowhere near the galaxy which is giving off the halo. And that galaxy in the middle there is actually only 3 billion light years away. So not only are these two phenomena separated in space, but also time. And as Einstein tells us, that's really just one thing, space-time. Now, this is a very interesting example of what I'm trying to convey here, because obviously you cannot see this with your naked eye. You can't see it even with really see it with a optical telescope on Earth, or even an optical telescope like the Hubble in space. But if you think about the Webb telescope, which is just an incredible piece of science and engineering and technology, and I would urge you to go to the Webb website, NASA's website of the Space Telescope, and look at what's involved in the construction and deployment of this telescope. It's an incredible feat of engineering and science that mankind accomplished in order to be able to make discoveries like what this tells us. But none of this is visible to the naked eye. None. None of it is visible to anything within the domain of sense perception of a normal human, but it becomes visible to us by the development of harnessing a multitude of scientific principles and creative thinking on the part of the whole team and all the scientists that made the discoveries along the way, to create an instrument that allows us to bring this phenomena into the domain where we can not just perceive it with our eyes, but perceive it in such a way that we can create concepts in our mind as to what is causing it. And all this is taking place beyond the domain of sense perception. Now, let's look at the next slide, and you'll see something even more fascinating about this. This is a schematic which NASA put out about this picture. And so you see on the left side there's the Webb telescope, which is orbiting the sun in a stationary, relatively stationary position. And then you have the blue galaxy is in the middle, and the blue galaxy actually bends the light that's coming from the background galaxy through what's called an Einstein ring, which is really a gravitational lens, because Einstein, in his theory of general relativity, realized that the interaction between light and gravity produces this kind of phenomena where the gravity bends the light. And it has the same effect as an optical lens, which uses glass to bend the light, refraction, so that an image which is very far away can be brought very close. The same principle is used for telescopes and microscopes. So here you have two principles which are beyond accessibility of a human mind, of human senses: gravity and infrared light, and even other wavelengths. Man is able to reach out and cause these phenomena to interact in such a way through this instrument, the Webb telescope, to enable us to hypothesize the existence of complex organic molecules in an area of the universe which is 13 billion light years away, which has huge implications for anything you're thinking about the nature of the universe. And it, if nothing else, is a evidence of the assertion by LaRouche and many others that life is a principle of the universe which exists everywhere in the universe at all times, not just in the Earth over the last period of years. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that there's life that has actually organized itself into living organisms throughout the universe. That we don't know. We don't have any evidence of it. But we do have evidence that life is a universal principle that exists everywhere in the universe. And that gives us an insight into the very nature of how the universe works, which is implies it is contrary to the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is organized and organizing itself in a creative way, and life is a principle which actually organizes the abiotic parts of the universe into the formation of living organisms. And ultimately, the same is true of cognition, human creative thought. Now, let's continue just with some examples. The next one, here's a picture of a flower. It's called a morning glory, common flower, very beautiful. And there's a company called Evident, which I think also makes Olympus cameras, which manufactures very precise scientific microscopes and other technologies. And every year they run a contest of among the people who are using their equipment to take pictures in the course of their research and submit the pictures to a photo contest. And this was just, the winners were just announced. And I just want to show you a couple of these because I think it illustrates this point. So you see, this is a morning glory, and in the very center of the morning glory, you can see the stamen of the plant, and you can see little grains of pollen, or at least imagine that you can see those in this picture. And this was taken with a regular camera. Now go to the next slide. And this is a picture that was taken with one of their devices, which is a picture of that grain, which is capturing the biochemical and morphological properties of the pollen grain, and how this living organism of this plant reproduces itself. is very beautiful, obviously, and it indicates, it suggests all kinds of things beyond just the particulars of the biochemical properties of the reproduction of a morning glory, which is what the person who took this picture was studying. But it indicates that there's a certain beauty to the universe that at all levels, in the macroscopic and the microscopic domain. Now let's look at another example. Here's a starfish, a very interesting animal, beautiful, five-fold symmetry, which is prevalent in living organisms, not prevalent at all in non-living processes. But this exhibits that five-fold symmetry in a very dramatic way. And then here is a, go to the next one. And this is a picture of a juvenile starfish taken by somebody, a researcher, who is studying the biochemical processes of the starfish's nervous system. And here you begin to see a whole characteristic of that process, which is not available in the visible characteristic, in the visible picture of the starfish. And so the beauty of the world only deepens the more you move beyond the domain of sense perception. And this is a general principle. I'm illustrating this very briefly and with certain, just these simple examples. The examples actually, I'm illustrating these by using in a simple way of these examples. These examples are not very simple. And I'm sure if we go into this in more, if you look at the actual research behind it, you'll find something even, more profound. But all this suggests that an underlying characteristic of both the physical domain, the abiotic domain, and the biotic domain, the domain of life, is characterized by beauty. There's a certain beauty to it. And the beauty is not just represented or not just exhibited by the representation in these various things, but in the sense of beauty that one has in thinking of these discoveries. Scientists often describe a discovery, a principle, as beautiful, even when it's not visible. If you go through Kepler's discovery of the elliptical orbits of the planets and the principle of gravitation, the only word that can describe it is beautiful. It's a beautiful process to see Kepler make this discovery. The same is true with Planck, Einstein, Riemann, any great scientific discovery. And when you then reduce this discovery to a mere description of the empirics, or a logical process, or a set of mathematical formulas, not that that's not important at times to be able to write down a precise mathematical formula. When you reduce it that way, you destroy the beauty, and therefore you destroy the concept. And you see this as a real problem in our scientific approach, in our education, and in our society today, because we have there's a turn away from beauty and from the importance and the principle of beauty as a necessary characteristic of science and of human life. This is why I think it's very interesting that in Trump's Agenda 47, and one of the last things, executive orders he did as president, was to require that all federal buildings be constructed beautifully instead of these ugly monstrosities, this brutalist architecture, which tends to convey the ideas of the mood of someone like Jack Smith or the FBI, that we're coming to get you and we got so much power and you better bend down to our will. Instead, there must be cities, federal buildings must be conform to principles of beauty. You see that in the Renaissance buildings. Much of the Renaissance buildings that we see in Europe are public buildings, civic buildings, buildings and churches, which all were had the purpose of organizing society and had to be organized around the principle of beauty. And this necessity of beauty in our daily lives, in our architecture, and our organization of society, I think I kind of indicated, is just is characteristic. It's a physical principle. It's a characteristic of the universe. It's not an arbitrary thing. And the more you study life and science and living processes and astrophysical processes, the more you see and cannot get away from this pervasive principle of beauty as a principle in the universe. And that has to cause you to ask the question, why? If the universe is just organized by, random interactions among particles, which sooner or later enough of them might bump together to form a cloud, and out of that cloud they bump together to form a galaxy. Why did they organize it? Why does it always end up beautiful? Why is the ability of a beehive to do a dance, to tell the other bees where the flowers are, and that the bees, with their very primitive nervous systems, can detect the polarization of the sunlight and can follow the instructions in the waggle dance, they call it, of the bee, to then send out the hunter bees to the beehive to collect the pollen to keep the beehive going in a beautiful way. This has got to be, this is something that a scientist cannot get away from, and neither can any of us. Now that brings me to the other point here, which is, I guess, the most important one, which is, well, what's going on with human beings? How is it we see that non-living things organize themselves according to principles beyond the domain of sense perception, which reflect beauty? Living processes do, as these brief pictures indicated. How does this work? And I would say that what you're seeing unfolding right now in the reaction, not just against the fascist policies of the Biden administration and what's being done to us in the assault, the satanic assault, which is occurring, I don't even want to go into it because it's easy to talk about it and you get distracted. You find yourself in many conversations with people and you say, isn't this ugly? And then the next thing you know, you're sitting around listing offenses and ugliness that we're surrounded by. There's obviously a reaction to that, which is driving people. But that's not what drives people. Mankind has tolerated ugliness in its society throughout our history. What is it that we're seeing beyond the domain of sense perception, beyond the mere appearances of what appears to be happening? It's not just a reaction against ugliness any more then the American Revolution was merely a reaction against taxation without representation or abuses by the British Crown. Sure, the Declaration of Independence recounts all those abuses, but that's not what it starts with. It starts with an enumeration of the principles on which mankind is based as given from God. So but that's not visible. But yet that's what's driving things. And in a situation like this, you really have to understand, how do you get in touch with, how do you discern that underlying principle, which in the midst of all this ugliness is fighting for beauty. Now, we build instruments like the Webb telescope or these microscopes and so forth to discern these principles, these physical principles, in the abiotic and the domain of life, like microscopes and spectroscopy and so forth. What instruments do we have by which we can discern this other process I'm talking about? And those instruments are called art. Why don't you put up the next slide, Susan? I get a little emotional talking about this, which shows you that it has to be true. But this is excuse me, this is a Rembrandt painting of St. Paul in his study. And I've always believed that this is a painting, although Rembrandt doesn't say it, of St. Paul when he was composing 1 Corinthians 13. And that's a well-known passage from the New Testament where St. Paul says, we see now as if in a glass darkly, but soon we will see face to face. I think that captures the concept which I've been trying to get across. We see as if in a glass darkly. And then he ends, I'm not going to quote, I don't know by heart, 1 Corinthians 13, but at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, he says that the greatest, you have faith, hope, and charity, or love, and the greatest of these is love. So that's what we have to access in this period, to not just get us through this period, but to ultimately win. And I think I'll stop there and take questions.